Hi, today I'm going to make a pressure canned raspberry swirl cake. Now before we get started, I want to let you know this is not a USDA approved recipe. A lot of canners will tell you this is unsafe because it hasn't been proven to be safe. My feeling is that just because it hasn't been proven to be safe does not mean that it's unsafe. But I want to talk for a moment about botulism. Botulism is serious, and it's something that we need to be aware of when we're canning, and we want to make sure that we have safe canning practices. Botulism is killed when the temperature gets to 240 degrees, and a pressure canner will get to that. Water boils at 212. A pressure canner is the only thing that can bring that up to 240 degrees, and this is going to be pressure canned cake. So there are also botulism spores, and the botulism spores themselves won't cause botulism, but if the spores are in your product, they can create botulism and cause problems. Botulism will grow in an environment where there's not a lot of oxygen, which we'll not have when we pressure can cake, where the temperatures are around 70 to 100 degrees, which most of our homes are where we're storing the cake. But it does not grow well when there's a lot of sugar. And this is going to have a fair amount of sugar in it, and that there's going to be a raspberry jam that has 13 grams of sugar with a tablespoon of jam, which I'm going to put in here. And there's also sugar in the recipe. But it is still a low acid food, and so while I feel this is safe for my family, you need to make your own decision. Additionally, I'm making sure I start with clean glasses to do the pressure canning and use as safe canning practices as I can. I'm also choosing to can in these shorter jars as opposed to the taller 8-ounce jar, simply because this will have more density and this will have less density. And so therefore I think the heat will even be more evenly distributed. So again, not an approved recipe, not tested by the USDA, but I just want you to be aware of that before we get going, okay? All right, so let's get started. I've already creamed some butter and some sugar. And again, a good amount of sugar in the recipe. So you want to cream that until it's fluffy. And then to that, I'm going to add a couple of eggs and some vanilla. And I'm going to mix that just until it's mixed up. So with cake recipes, you generally don't want to over mix your recipes because your cake can get tough that way. I'm also learning that when I'm doing pressure canned cakes, I really have the best results with cake flour rather than regular flour. And I tried making my own cake flour. That's where you're going to add baking powder to your flour. Hasn't really worked. So if you do this recipe, please make sure that you get cake flour. All right, so this is mixed pretty well now. It's kind of a yellow color and it's smooth. And now I'm going to alternate adding a mixture of flour, baking powder, baking soda, and salt. And I'm going to mix that with water. And not water, I'm sorry, I'm going to add some milk to that. I'm going to alternate that. What I want to do is mix this just until it's mixed together. I really don't want to overmix. So I'm going to alternate adding my milk and adding my flour until the batter comes together. And again, once it comes together, then I'm going to stop mixing right away. Now in the meantime, I've heated my pressure canner. I did not preheat my jars because I find I have better results with that, but my pressure canner is heated. And I'm going to put this in the pressure canner for 35 minutes. Based on my research, botulism spores are killed at 30 minutes at 240 degrees. So it's another precaution that I'm choosing to take. So I've added the rest of my milk. I want to add the rest of my dry ingredients, like so. And I've spilled some of them, so I'm going to put those in there too. And just like that, my batter is brought together. So I'm going to unplug my machine. Always want to have safe fingers. And what I have is a batter that is nice and smooth. It's light yellow. It's a little bit loose, but that's okay. That's what I'm looking for. So I'm going to show you this. And the consistency is basically cake batter. Now, to this, I'm going to move these things so that you can maybe see a little bit better here. Let me adjust the camera for a second. All right, I think you've got a little bit better view. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take each of my jars, and I don't want to fill them more than 2/3 full. So I'm simply going to spoon some cake batter into each of the jars, adding about half of what I want to have in there total. And then when I get to about that halfway mark, I'm going to add a tablespoon of the raspberry jam. Now I took my jam and put it in a separate bowl simply because I don't want to cross-contaminate that. So I'm going to take a generous spoonful of the jam, put that in there, and then I'm going to top it with more cake batter. And let's see where we're at. And we are about 2/3 full there. So, like so. All right, so I'm going to repeat this with all 4 jars, and when I get done with that, then I'll be back. All right, so I have my 4 8-ounce jars filled, and this recipe makes about 4-ounce jars. I have them filled probably about 3/4 of the way full. But I also want to debubble this. Debubbling with canning, you remove the air, and that kind of helps everything cook evenly. And you can see, if I look, you're not going to be able to see it. I have a few air bubbles in the batter. So I like to use the edge of a wooden spoon and just go around and get the bubbles out as best as I can. That also is part of the reason I call this a raspberry swirl cake, because this debubbling swirls that batter a little bit. But I think that's an important step to do. It's an important step anytime you're canning, is to debubble. And one more to go here. So I just am going around the outside of the edge and tapping that. Now lots of people use knives. I've used knives in the past. They say not to use a knife primarily because the edge of a knife could put scratches into your glass and make your glass less stable down the road, but that's a choice you'll have to make. So what I'm going to do lastly then is, because this has butter in it, it has eggs, and it has sugar, I'm going to use just a little bit of vinegar on a clean towel and clean the edges of this, because I want to make sure that any sugars or any grease from the butter is off the edges of these jars. I want to make sure that I can get a good seal on these. So I'm just going to wipe around the edge of each one. I want to make sure that that vinegar was squeezed out pretty well, because obviously I don't want vinegar in my cake. And I'll do that. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to finger tighten these with the lids and the bands and put them in the canner for 35 minutes. So what you can see is that I really do have a little bit of a swirl. So again, I put the batter in the jar. I put a good tablespoon of jelly in the middle of it, the raspberry jam. I used this kind. I've had real good luck with it in the past. And then I debubbled it, which more or less creates the swirl. So lastly, I'm going to take my lids. Now lids, in the past, you used to have to put them in hot water. Check the back of your box, because the newer lids don't require that anymore. They changed the compound on the lids, and so you don't need to soak them in hot water. That said, you might have some older lids at home, so do follow the direction on your lids. So I'm simply going to place a lid on each one of these. I'm going to place a band on it and finger tight, not real tight. Going to do each one of those. I'm going to put them in the canner for 35 minutes. After they're there, I'm going to remove them from the canner, and I'm going to let them sit overnight. And hopefully I'll have a seal on each one. And then tomorrow, I will be back and I will show you the results with our cake. All right, so onward and forward. All right, so the raspberry swirl cake just finished in the pressure canner. I pressure canned it for 35 minutes. Let's see what it looks like. Okay. It looks pretty good. We have, I'm going to get the water off here, a little bit browned jars. I don't know if you can see that, but the cake looks like cake. Each of the jars has brown cake, and I think that this batch also will turn out well. This is the second time I've made this cake. I think that it's a fairly safe recipe simply because it is very high in sugar, and botulism can't grow in sugar. That said, I am going to remind you once again that it is not a USDA approved recipe. Good for my family. You'll have to make your decision for yourself. I'm going to let these rest for 12 to 24 hours. Actually, it's about 4 o'clock in the afternoon my time, so I need to let these rest until at least early morning tomorrow. I'll open up a jar and we'll see what it's like. All right, I'm back with our pressure canned cake, and we definitely have success. The recipe I did yesterday, I originally called it a raspberry swirl because I had raspberry jam and that's what I used. But it dawned on me overnight that really any kind of jam you like can be used. So if you don't like raspberry, use strawberry, grape, apricot, any kind of jam, orange marmalade. Use what kind of jam you have on hand and make this cake because this recipe is going to work with any of it. The recipe actually made 5 containers, and I have to confess I opened one last night and had it, and it was pretty good, but I've got the other 4 here, and it turned out really well. First of all, the cake really browned nicely, so it looks like cake. You might recall I put batter in, then I put the jam in the middle and the batter on top, and the jam did settle to the bottom. First time I made this, I put the jam at the bottom right away, and I thought, put it in the middle, but it settled to the bottom either way. The jam also infused the cake, infused in the cake. So I have that raspberry flavor throughout the cake is what I noticed last night. But I want to open one up for you and show you what it looks like. So again, this was pressure canned. It's high sugar content, and high sugar environments do not support botulism. So I feel really comfortable that this is canned well. And again, anytime you have something and it's pressure canned, you want to make sure that you got a good seal. And you know you have a good seal when you push on the can and it doesn't give it all. If it doesn't seal, when you push on the lid, it's actually going to indent a little bit. So we have what looks like cake right from the beginning. It's brown, it's cake-like, it's not moist in terms of wet, which maybe you would expect with the steam. So I'm going to try and take this out of the jar. I did it in the jar thinking you could just eat it in the jar, and I think that would still work. Well, it does work, I know, because I tried it last night. So I'm going to try and take this out of the jar just for demonstration purposes, and we'll see if that works. Yeah, a little bit messy, but it worked okay. The jam was on the bottom, and I'm just going to spread that on the top a little bit. But it worked really well in terms of what the cake is. So again, I'm going to show you what that looks like. Brown throughout. And I'm going to use a bread knife to cut it because I don't want to compress it with a regular knife. And we really have a nice cakey environment for the cake. So I don't know if you can see that, but it's very cake-like. And to taste it, it's just as good as it was last night. A pressure canned cake is going to be just a little bit more dense than an oven baked cake. I think about anything else you pressure can, it's a little bit different than if you cook it in the oven or if you cook it on the stove. But this is really good. I think you can do this with any kind of jam that you want. I did the 5th jar in a taller jar. 8-ounce jars is what I was using for these, and that worked out really well. In fact, I liked the texture of that even just a tiny bit more than I do this one. But that said, any 8-ounce jar works. I'm not sure how this would work in a 16-ounce jar, and I definitely wouldn't try it in a quart jar. But this recipe is really great. I'm going to call it jam-infused pressure cake, something along that line. The recipe is in the link below. If you want to have cake long-term storage, this is the way to go. It can be done. I believe it's safe because it was pressure canned for 35 minutes. And again, high sugar content does not support botulism. So, cake, enjoy. Hope you like this recipe. If you found this interesting at all, thumbs up would be appreciated. Subscribe to my channel. I think I'll be doing some more cakes, but I'll also be doing a number of other items, both for dehydrating and canning, and bringing you other original recipes. So in the meantime, Happy pressure canning.